Hello, folks, and welcome back to World War II TV. And this is the second show in our Disasters and Tragedies week, which I don't apologize for, is a rather dramatic name for a week, but all the stories we're covering do have these tragic elements to them. I've been looking forward to this show, despite its rather tragic subject matter. I have been reading an extraordinary amount of books over the last 2 or 3 years, and Rampage, by today's guest, is just one of those books that I will never forget reading, an important read. And we're off to Manila in 1945. And my guest today, James Scott, the author of several books. We're talking about Rampage. So good afternoon, James. How are you doing?
Hey, Paul. Thanks so much for having me on the show. I appreciate being here.
Well, we very much appreciate you having you. And there's people watching from the Philippines now who've stayed up late to watch it. Tone, one of my friends, is watching it. So, it is an important subject. We just talked very briefly before going live, about the content of the book. And for those watching, there will be some pretty harrowing, graphic stories covered tonight. And exactly how many we will say of them is kind of down to where the conversation goes. But it's important history to get across, isn't it? And that's why we were just saying it is a civilian experience story as opposed to a military campaign book.
Absolutely. No, it very much is.
So, we'll leap in a minute. We've got some personalities to talk about as well, but, there's a lot to cover today. And as usual, folks, if you've got comments or questions, particularly those of you who've been to the Philippines or have got any personal interest in this, I'm sure James will be happy hearing your comments and your observations about this. But I say a warning again, it will get a bit kind of graphic, the descriptions of some of the horrors there. And it also connects this show to the Pacific week we had last week, because, we talked about New Guinea and campaign and Buna and Kokoda, and we talked about Okinawa with Sol David on Friday. So it's all that progression across the Pacific. But, we're talking about the impact, particularly in Manila, the city. So when you've written about the Pacific theater a lot, James, but why did you decide to do this book? Was it visiting there? Was it something you read? What was the kind of starting point for you?
What's fascinating about the Battle of Manila in so many ways is sort of the history of the Philippines, and specifically Manila, leading up to the war. And because a lot of people forget that the Philippines was actually, an American colony before World War II. And Manila has this amazing history going all the way back, really to the turn of the century. The United States captured the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. But unlike Cuba, which we declared to be, gave them their independence, we decided to hang on to the Philippines, largely for its great strategic location there in the Pacific. And so from about the early 1900s leading up to World War II, America made a pretty significant investment in really transforming the Philippines into an enclave of America in the Pacific, going so far as to bring in one of America's top landscape planners and municipal planners to literally kind of help redesign the Philippines sort of in our image, if you will. And that included sort of coming up with a new city master plan, coming up with building architecture, designs, and whatnot. And of course, at the same time as as Manila was developing, lots of American companies sort of all poured in as well. So you had, B.F. Goodrich, you had General Electric, you had Ford, Studebaker. And so you had all these American companies making these big investments there. And of course, many Americans living there. And so, America really, the Philippines really became sort of this colonial outpost, if you will, for the United States, all, of course, in this amazing tropical setting. And so, that's sort of the lead up. And as you can see here from these terrific photos that kind of give you a glimpse into what Manila looked like before the war, you're actually looking at the Escolta. That photo just a second ago was that's the Fifth Avenue, they called it, of the Philippines, if you will. And that's where you had all the great retail shops and department stores. So it really was sort of a small slice of America in the Pacific.
It's almost the American version of what the British have in Singapore, or Singapore is a British version of what the Americans have in the Philippines, depending on which point of view. But it's these important areas that are for transport, for trade. They've been there for hundreds of years. They are multicultural in many ways, and yet also very modern. They've got these incredible histories, but they're also bang up to date. And we've been talking about in the Pacific Campaign recently about this even going back to our medics week, and we had Lee Mandel coming on talking about combat stress, PTSD, how men who fought in the Pacific didn't get those liberations of Paris or Brussels or Amsterdam. They didn't get the waving flags and the cheering civilians and the chocolate bars and the kisses from girls. And the Pacific campaign, after its brutality, kind of deserved that end bit, even though I know the units and divisions were rotating through the Pacific theater. But at the same time, as it got towards 1945, it's like everybody in that theater was waiting for some kind of moment where it would feel that all the effort and all the loss of life have been worthwhile. And in a way, the Philippines could have become that, but as we will find out, absolutely didn't. I mean, it just didn't become that. And yet, interestingly, and this is being reminded going through your book again today, there was a chance that the Philippines wasn't even going to be attacked at all. It's going to be simply bypassed by the way the Pacific campaign is going. So just, not that we're going to go into the military campaigning too much, but just kind of run through those kind of options that were facing allies as it kind of got to end of 44, early 45.
Absolutely. Well, at that time in the war, America had sort of been on this sort of two-prong approach, kind of driving up, as you can see here from the map, across the Central Pacific, which is what the Navy and the Marines were doing, while the Army and MacArthur were coming up from the South, from Australia. And so in the summer of 1944, the U.S. was trying to decide what was going to be sort of the next step. Where were these forces going to meet to make that sort of final push on Japan? And MacArthur, of course, was really adamant that it was going to be the Philippines. And it's important to remember, MacArthur has a long personal family tie to the Philippines. And I'll get into that in just a moment. Whereas the Navy was saying we should skip the Philippines really and jump up to Formosa, which today, of course, is Taiwan. That would put the United States that much closer to Japan. And the idea being that those Japanese forces left behind in the Philippines would, quote unquote, wither on the vine. They would be cut off, they would be left there, etc. So the Navy and the Army sort of had this powwow in the summer of 1944 in a mansion on Hawaii with FDR. And MacArthur comes in, and of course, his subsequent retellings of this event are that he was kind of blindsided by this, and he shows up there, and the Navy's there with maps and pointers and documents to make its case. And of course, he comes in unaware of what it's about and sort of has to sort of wing it all on his own to convince FDR that the Philippines is the right path to go. But we know by looking at the diary of his pilot, that that's not the case at all. In fact, he knew exactly what was going on. He spent much of that time flying from Australia all the way to Hawaii in a B-17, literally rehearsing his arguments, if you will, pacing and trying them out on his pilot. So by the time he actually gets to Hawaii, he's really ready for this. And of course, the reality is, Admiral King, who was sort of the chief of the Navy, was very much in favor of going to Formosa, but others weren't 100% sure that was the best avenue. Recognizing that the Japanese did have big forces in the Philippines, did have a lot of aircraft there. Of course, this was the time which kamikazes had been or was about to be coming online. And so that they could really menace American forces if we were above them. And so Chester Nimitz was kind of in that camp. And so he was sent to represent the Navy side. So they sort of powwow, if you will, throughout the course of this night. And MacArthur ultimately makes less of a sort of strategic appeal to FDR as he does a moral appeal. And again, it falls back on the fact that the United States had the Philippines as a colony. And he says, we have, since he left in 1942 and swore to return, that those people had been desperately waiting for America to come and to liberate them. And for America to finally have the opportunity to come back to the Philippines and to liberate them, and to skip that and jump farther up would be just morally unconscionable to these subjects. And so he kind of made that appeal to FDR. And then, of course, he also made it, he later that night sort of pulls him aside and he says to him, I know the American people are going to agree with me on this, and that if you don't do this, they're going to hold it against you at the polls. And of course, FDR was running for re-election, and of course, he was nothing if not a political animal. And so he actually goes to bed that night and he summons his physician, the president does, and he says, no one has ever spoken to me like that. Give me an aspirin. And then he says, actually, give me 2. And so we now know, of course, that that's the reality. FDR greenlights MacArthur's return to the Philippines, and it sort of sets in motion the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and eventually the retaking of Luzon and the Battle of Manila. Now, to back up a little bit, what's the Battle of Manila?
Your audio just went weird a bit there for a second, James. Hang on. This happened in one of last week's shows. You're frozen a bit. Just here we go again, folks. Technical difficulties. It was all going so smoothly. Try going out and coming in again, James.
Is that
sorry about this? It sounds like a robot voice at the moment. I think something's gone up with the broad. Try dropping out and coming in again. Sorry about that, folks. We do get these issues sometimes. It's everything goes fine in a test, and it goes weird on a day. But yeah, we will get into the personalities of MacArthur. And those who've been watching me over Pacific Week, you realise that I'm not a great lover of General MacArthur. I don't think most modern military historians are great lovers of MacArthur. But as James will explain in a minute, he does have this personal vested interest in the Philippines. And I was saying to James in the emails, his book is one of the few that actually makes me. I don't like MacArthur, and I don't come out reading James' books still any more liking MacArthur than I've always disliked him. But I have an empathy. I have an empathy for him because of this connection to it. So hopefully you're back again, James.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I got you again now. Yeah. So I was just saying to the folks about how we've been discussing MacArthur recently on the show, and I'm still not a great fan. But your book, as I said on the email to you, comes as close as any other does to kind of having an empathy for him, because what you were just explaining about there with this meeting with FDR, he's right to a certain point. The American public should have a vested interest in the Philippines. We don't see that much in the Pacific. That's where me as an ETO guy, so many decisions in the European theater operations are based on the civilian population. They are based on the histories. Look at the story of Paris in the summer of '44, where its history comes into the same you can apply to Italy and Rome. We are thinking on a campaign footing, but we're also thinking about the civilian populations of these countries. The Pacific doesn't really have that until you get the Philippines. So MacArthur was kind of right to bring in the American public, because the Philippines have been talked about in the press. MacArthur, as you say, by saying he shall return, that was a big thing in the press. And I think I will let you talk in a minute, James. It's important to understand that MacArthur was as close as the USA has to a demigod in the middle of the World War II. I mean, our understanding of him today is different to how he was perceived back then. I mean, he was arguably the most important person in the world. I mean, Eisenhower, I guess, would argue with him, but he's an incredibly important figure, and the public did love him back then, didn't they?
They did. And you have to remember, too, after his stand on Bataan, in which he was very much glorified in the press and things like that. I mean, there was actually an uptick in 1942 of new babies being born who were named Douglas. There was hairstyles that were named after him, bridges, stadiums. I mean, he was, during the stand on Bataan, really just, a huge national celebrity, because he and his men were seen as the only Americans after Pearl Harbor who were making a stand and able to fight back. Because, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, America lost Wake Island, it lost Guam, and here were the defenders of Bataan. And of course, MacArthur, who had been he'd been actually the Army's first public affairs officer ever. He understood the importance of narrative. He understood the importance of imagery and whatnot. So he wrote all those 140 press releases that went out to the press. And in all of those, he glorified one officer, himself. Yeah. And so he was a master at shaping the narrative. But, as I was saying before we got cut off too, for him, the Philippines, it wasn't just about the United States and sort of its commitment to the Philippines. And it's really important that we look at MacArthur and his family and their role in the Philippines, because you have to remember, his father was one of the ones who helped capture Manila during the Spanish-American War, served as one of the early military governors there. Douglas MacArthur had served frequently throughout his career, 4 different times actually in the Philippines, from the time he graduated West Point all the way up until 1935, when he moves over permanently to the Philippines at that point to help build them a modern military. His mother died in the Philippines. He courted his wife in the Philippines. His son was born there in the Philippines. And MacArthur, who had grown up the son of a military officer, I mean, really an army brat, had spent his entire life pinballing around, the America and the world. Manila was like his hometown.
Yeah.
And of course, all that changes when the war breaks out in 1941. I mean, he ultimately flees his home there in the penthouse atop the Manila Hotel so fast in late 1941 that they leave the Christmas tree still standing in one corner. He leaves behind his father's Civil War medals. He leaves behind his shotguns, his son's toys, everything. So coming back to the Philippines for MacArthur is about coming home.
Yeah. And whether we like him or not, he had given pretty much his entire life to his country and hadn't had very much, I guess we'd call it in 21st century parlance, me time. Yeah. And I guess his few years pre-war was his me time because he had a less important role. His son, he doted on his son. He loved his his wife was younger than him, but he was having the best personal time of his life, wasn't he? And that's important to understand, even if we find some of his military decision-making in World War II a little bit iffy by our standards now. We have to have some empathy and sympathy for a guy who was pushed out of his home. And another recurring theme we've talked about on World War II TV with the Pacific campaign is this old traditional way of talking about as being far from home. And it's far from home if you're a Liverpudlian soldier who finds himself in Singapore, but it's not far from home if you happen to live in Burma or you happen to live in, and for MacArthur, this was a battle on his home turf. It was a home battle. And that we have to understand that. We have to whether we appreciate, say, all his decision making is one thing, but we have to understand the fact he does have a very, very personal interest in his battle, and I think loved the people of the Philippines. I think he genuinely had their interests at heart. It comes into that kind of Churchill category of maybe his vision for them isn't what we would think of their vision today, because he was an old-fashioned guy with more of an empirical kind of view of the world. But I think he had a genuine affection for the people there, and that comes across in your writing, I think.
There's no doubt about that. And I think you hit on a really good point too, which is this was the first time in life he had his me time. And you have to understand, I mean, he grew up between two pressure cooker of parents. His father had been the Civil War hero. He had the original helicopter mom. I mean, she hovered over him to the point that she moved to West Point to track his career, and to the point too where she would put him down to bed at night and whisper in his ear, "You're going to grow up to be a great man like your father." And I mean, it's really, and then of course she dies in the Philippines, and of course dies in the Manila hotel where he lives, in her bedroom there, and he orders it sealed for a year. But he also later said, look, growing up in the lifestyle I did, these kinds of parents, and the pressure was something I would never wish upon my own son. So, I mean, you later get a glimpse into that. And as you noted, he's in the Philippines at this point. It's a laid back lifestyle. It's the tropics. He's got a son, he's got his beautiful wife. I mean, he's going to movies at night, and they're in the air conditioning. They're going on strolls out along the waterfront. I mean, for him, it's what he's longed for. And all of that gets taken away in December 1941.
And that, in a weird way, when we talk about military leaders and politicians, you always say don't mix business and pleasure. And for him, having a guy coming back commanding an army, more than an army, he's commanding an entire force, having a personal interest is maybe not good for the rest of us, because that possibly can cloud your judgment and what have you. But I think we ought to bring in, we'll come back to MacArthur, of course, in due course, his opposite number defending the Philippines, because an equally interesting figure, albeit with a very different kind of experience with the Japanese military history. But let's talk a little bit about the other gentleman in the photo there.
Yep, General Yamashita. Yes, he was an equally fascinating character on the Japanese side. He was basically at the very beginning of the war had earned this huge reputation by capturing Singapore and Malaysia from the British. And he had done it literally in just, a matter of weeks. using bicycles, which is just really ingenious, sort of the way to kind of come down the peninsula there. And as a result of that, he'd earned the nickname the Tiger of Malaya. But he was, but at the same time, sort of his sort of rising stardom put him at odds with Hideki Tojo, who was prime minister and war minister, to the point where Tojo was trying to consolidate power and he couldn't be threatened by Yamashita. So he basically exiles Yamashita to Manchuria for most of the war. And there he's literally sitting on the sidelines. And it's not until 1944 when Japan loses the Mariana Islands, Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, which for the first time put the homeland in range of America's B-29s. That leads to the toppling of Tojo. And of course, Tojo's ouster leads to the resurrection of Yamashita. And he is immediately sent to the Philippines, which to sort of bog down MacArthur and to slow him down from his march north toward the Japanese homeland. And so you really have, these two just amazingly huge individuals squaring off in the Philippines, so it's a battle of two titans, if you will.
And the Japanese tactics, generally in the Pacific, by this point, by early 45, I mean, let's be honest, they no longer can win this war. It's all about how much of a bloody nose they give the Allies, how much of a stand they make. And when we look at the island hopping and we look at, from Guam, Saipan, and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, it's kind of getting worse and worse and worse as we get closer and closer to the Japan itself, and yet they can't win. And you get the island hopping, where it's this sort of suicide fight the last round. The Philippines isn't quite that way. It's kind of it's much more, I think, military strategy. There's much more thought put into holding every road junction, holding everything, every bridge, every vital traffic node. And they in a sense, he uses all that experience of 1941 back again. I read something today where someone compared him to Guderian in the ETO, which I thought was an interesting comparison. I didn't necessarily completely agree with it, but he's good at improvisational war, I suppose, whereas a lot of the Japanese commanders on the islands are kind of there's not much thought behind what they're doing. It's just kind of go in bunkers and kill as many Americans as you can and then eventually die. There's not much intelligence behind that in some ways. But the defense of the Philippines, there's a sense that some people with some military understanding have given it some of their attention, which proved to end up being the disaster it was. Because going back to MacArthur again, he'd made this impassioned plea to FDR. He'd got his way, but he didn't really think there was going to be much of a fight for the Philippines, did he?
No, he didn't. And Yamashita is a great soldier and great commander, as you noted. I mean, he really took a look at his strategic situation and he said, how can I best delay the Americans, even if it's for as little as half a day, is what he put out in his orders. Because really at that point, I mean, the fall of the Mariana Islands is really the tipping point. I mean, even at that point, everyone in Japanese leadership, whether they would admit it or not, really understood that it was a game changer and that they were trying to hold out as long as they could effectively in order to be able to make the best peace possible, not to have an unconditional surrender and not to have to risk the throne and the emperor and everything. And so Yamashita then is given the Philippines as his goal. And he'd grown up in a rural environment. And so he understood, mountains and woods and the advantage. And he also recognized that there was no way he could compete with the American superiority of weaponry, ammunition, and just force size. And so he would fall back on using the landscape against the Americans. And so he would retreat. He divides up his army into several smaller groups, and he spreads them out into the jungles and mountains with the idea of making sort of a protracted guerrilla war against the Americans, to just eat away at them if you can and tie them down, because it really, at this point, he's not fighting to win. He's fighting for time.
Yeah. And I think we have to acknowledge that by this point in the war, the US Army, the US Marine Corps is getting a bit campaign weary. If they really want a nice, swift, easy campaign to just kind of take the pressure off a bit, because everything they've been doing so far has been a slugging match, and there are more slugging matches to come as well after this.
And more big ones to come.
These two forces going the same, in different directions to the same location. So it's getting worse and worse. But everyone kind of wants an easy one there, and he uses that terrain. He uses what it is. And when we get to Manila itself, of course, no soldier from any side in any theater likes urban warfare. If it's one aspect in which all our armies are generally undertrained, it's urban warfare, because of the difficulty of replicating urban warfare in training. You can train tank maneuvers in New Mexico for the American military, or in Salisbury Plain for the British. You can practice platoon tactics on the parade ground almost, but urban warfare, there's lots of theory involved. But when buildings start collapsing around you and you have fires, it's no one likes it, and it becomes a defender's preference in a sense. We talked about in Italy, we talked about some of the fight, Ortona, for example, Canadians, where the Germans made every single street a complete fortress, and despite overwhelming numbers, the Canadians just couldn't get through these streets. And the same thing applies to Manila. We'll get there in a minute. And then, of course, there's a human tragedy element, which we'll get to, of course, in a minute. So yeah, it's all, the stage is set, unfortunately, without anybody really realizing it, for one of the most tragic battles of World War II. So bring us up to the invasion.
Okay, yeah, and one thing I think is important is not only is this sort of the tragedy being set in motion, it's important to look at what's happened to the people in Manila.
Yeah,
from the MacArthur's evacuation up until now, which is
good point.
The Japanese, of course, have during the 3 years they occupied the Philippines, have just disastrously mismanaged the local economy. They came in, they looted all the department stores, they looted the pharmacies, they shipped off all the farm equipment and everything. And so that what has happened is you've seen this huge humanitarian crisis in what was once this great city, to the point that literally by the time MacArthur is about to come back, about 500 people a day are starving to death in Manila. It's gotten so desperate that parents are unable to care for their kids, are literally selling their children. I've actually seen documents related to the sale of children. They're abandoning them to orphanages. The economy, it's become literally a bartering economy. I mean, there's sort of a whole buy-sell market, if you will. Animals are being eaten, horses, etc. And of course, it's important to remember that in Manila, there are thousands of American and Allied prisoners of war, internees, who were those folks that were left behind. These were, of course, the folks who worked for Ford, B.F. Goodrich, and, as well as, military forces that were trapped, on Bataan and Corregidor, who were there in the Philippines. And of course, they're starving to death as well. The Americans are actually the largest internment camp. One of the largest internment camps that Japanese had is right there in the heart of Manila, Santo Tomas, which is one of the oldest universities in the Pacific, and 3,700, mostly Americans, but a lot of other allied nations is represented there as well, starving to death at the rate of 3 to 4 a day. And so
and having to buy rats to eat, which is another harrowing part of your book there. I mean, not only have you got to eat rats, you've got to actually pay money for the privilege of eating a rat, which tells you how bad things have got.
Man, that is the anecdote. When I was researching this book, and I was trying to, and I interviewed survivors. In fact, I've been to the Santo Tomas Association's reunions the last couple of years. I'm going again in April of next year. When I was researching this, and I found that diary in which not only did she say exactly that we had to eat rats, but we were having to pay 8 pesos each for a rat. Nothing communicates how bad hunger is like having to buy a rat to eat it. And
I mean, it's just dreadful. I mean, it's interesting. I'm reading a book right now for a future show by Sarah Kovner about the Japanese prisoner of war camps, where she's kind of turned all our preconceptions on their head, and actually sort of often a lot of the Japanese, what we think of as cruelty, was more just disorganization on their part, because they were simply overwhelmed with numbers. And it doesn't excuse or forgive the barbarity of war, but it wasn't, she's turning the researcher's head. And I think when we're thinking about, me as a Brit, and I think of our guys getting off the boats in Singapore and Changi, at least when you've got military prisoners, they have a hierarchy, they have a structure, they have organization, they have that. In Manila, in the Philippines, you're talking about people of all age groups, of different colors, of different male, female, children, and the medical and issues that gave the Japanese an extra headache. I mean, it doesn't excuse their barbarity, but you can understand how it had become increasingly overwhelming for them. Young kids going through puberty, all those kind of things that gave them an extra level of horror there to endure.
What's fascinating about that is, so you have these 3,700 internees in Santo Tomas, and yes, they weren't like the military, so they didn't have that hierarchy, but they effectively built a city. They created department heads, sanitation, police, education. They built school systems, and it got so detailed that they literally, for each of their meetings, kept meeting minutes. And if you go to the Library of Congress in Washington, there are actually microfilm reels in which you can read the meeting minutes of how organized they were. And of course, so they did all this all the way up until about February 1944. That's when the food starts running out. And when the food starts running out, the organization starts to break down. And so that's when, all the good work they had done, to sort of survive and persevere really breaks down in 44. And of course, accelerates up until 45. So by the time MacArthur comes back in 1945, internees are living off about 700 calories a day. I mean, literally starvation levels.
Which also it brings us to the fact that if that's going on with the civilian population, the Japanese, I know that they're defending in the hills, but their stress levels are up as well, because organization has started to collapse. It's been collapsing for months now, if not years. And so everything, it's a tinderbox for things to go wrong, because everybody's on immense stress levels, and they know, as you said, there's a massive Great Invasion fleet coming in, and they're all the associated bombing and bombardment. So, as I said earlier, echoing what I said, it's an absolute, it's ripe for a tragedy to incur, because all the ingredients are in place. Exactly. Desperation, pity, panic, hunger, and society essentially breaking down. Unfortunately, you get that when we've done shows on the Warsaw Uprising and things like that, and the ghettos there. Eventually, when food gets so short, society starts breaking down as well. So just absolute recipe for disaster coming up. So talk us through the actual beginning of the landings and the approach to Manila itself.
So after of course, the very famous sea battles there for Leyte, the theater really shifts over to Luzon, which is the main island in the Philippines. It's sort of the cultural, political hub. So MacArthur comes back and lands in early January of 1945. Troops start coming ashore there, and it takes them about 3 weeks until February 3rd to sort of cover that 100 miles that separate Lingayen Gulf, the beaches there, to Manila. And it's sort of a slow sort of southward push as they're kind of double checking and making sure that they're not going to get ambushed. Of course, that then leaves them to right up to the front door of Manila at 6:30 p.m. on the night of February the 3rd, 1945. And so these are a few photos actually from the Bataan Death March.
Yeah, they're earlier, just showing how things just have been building up tension there for years now. And some of the photos you sent are just awful. I mean, they're great in the sense of the detail they show, but awful in the the nature of some of the imagery there. All sorts of things come through. When you sent me I'm reminded of Ethiopia in the 1980s and the famines there, and just awful photos, but important for us to see.
Totally, yeah. That's the occupation currency that the Japanese had when they were in the Philippines. I've got several of those notes, here in my collection. So. And that gives you a sense, too, of just those photographs of the starvation on the children. I mean, you can see the rib cage, the bones, everything.
Tell us that. I mean, I listened to the History Hack episode again today, but one of my favorite stories in that is that the poor girl who thought she had a lump in her body.
Exactly. Yeah, that's Louise Goldthorpe. And so she had dropped down to, about 90 pounds or so. And so she was laying there, and could feel this lump, and she wrote this in her diary. She could feel this lump in her stomach, and of course, which alarmed her. What is it, a tumor? What is it, something like else? And then she realized she was actually feeling her backbone through her stomach. So just how emaciated. I mean, you look at those 5 gentlemen there on your right, they're from Santo Tomas. I mean, those 5 men lost a combined total of over 270 pounds. And of course, it created a whole army of beggars, children, folks like that you see there on the left, with open sores and things like that from malnutrition, begging for food.
And again, with these are often civilian workers and just people living there. They're not, when British Army prisoners or American Army people were captured at Bataan, at least they had training. They were in good physical condition before they went into captivity, so and they were younger as well, which helps immensely. You can tell on some of those faces on the right there, those guys aren't 22, 23. They're considerably older, so that the strain of on an older body is greater than that on a young fit guy. And so absolutely telling revealing what the details are in those photos. And there's what the meal tickets you sent from other internment camps.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's how the Japanese, you basically got them punched when you showed up to eat early on. And so that one's from 1942. I've got that here in my office, actually.
Wow.
And of course, one of the breakdowns, this is one of the things too, is the grave robbing became pretty rampant in Manila. Literally, people were digging up bodies because you could take eyeglasses off a body, you could take dentures, even clothing, things like that. Because as I noted earlier, it became a bartering economy about buying and selling. And so that families, a lot of times when they were burying bodies, they would literally cut the clothing on the body that they were burying to prevent somebody from wanting to steal it off the remains. And
again, that's a symptom of society essentially breaking down, because
exactly.
Common decency is having to take a second place to survival. I mean, no one's ever us listening and watching this, are never going to judge anybody for making these decisions. If you've got to feed your family, you've got to feed your family. But to try and have some empathy for people who have been reduced to that level where, decency and respect for the dead, respect for your neighbor, and eating animals. It's important for us to understand how bad it had got, which is and important while we're doing this show, as people have been saying there. And I'll just keep going through these photos, and please.
This is, of course, the return, and this is actually that's the return to the Philippines in January 1945 to the Lingayen Gulf. And then the next slide actually is when troops start rolling into Manila. So here we are, February 3rd, 1945. The cavalry arrives in Manila, and they head straight for Santo Tomas. They're there to liberate the civilians. And of course, it becomes this huge euphoric celebration for all these, internees who are on the verge of starvation when American tanks show up and roll through the gates. And got some great footage here.
And unfortunately, for the Americans who are participating in this, it kind of, the first bits they saw of the city did not reveal the full horror, because the outskirts were not quite as bad as when things got in the middle, and they were experiencing the roadblocks, and the Japanese had did charges around junctions and that. But it was definitely the lull before the storm. It was when they got to the old city is where things got really bad. But yeah, so amazing. There is quite a lot of footage on YouTube. I just pulled out a couple of minutes here and there of some of the footage, just some of the conditions there.
Yeah, and this
is the baseball stadium, isn't it? Yeah, stadium.
Yeah, Rizal Stadium. So, because what happens is the Americans come in and they liberate Santo Tomas, then they liberate Bilibid Prison the next day, which is where the military folks are being held just a few blocks away. And the same time that they arrive, Japan begins to start burning the city. And they start north of the river, because what had happened is, even though Yamashita was the overall theater commander, there was a Rear Admiral, Sanji Iwabuchi, whose job it was to blow up port facilities. And because really the only strategic value of Manila was its deep water anchorage for the U.S. Navy. And so he's left behind to sort of blow up the port and the warehouses. And then the idea is that he's going to evacuate. But he decides, and you have to understand, he was a failed sea captain earlier in the war, had a ship shot out from under him off of Guadalcanal, and it survived, which was a big disgrace in the Japanese culture. And so he'd sat out much of the war riding desk jobs until the deaths of so many other more capable seafaring officers led to his career resurrection, and he was sent to the Philippines. And so there he's in Manila, over about 17,000 troops. And his job, of course, is to, basically blow up the warehouses and things like that. But he decides that he's going to make it an urban bloodletting for the Americans. He's going to take Yamashita's order to do anything you can to slow down the Americans, and he's going to run with that order. And so he starts barricading the city. They go through and they start putting about 50 intersections in downtown Manila. They put tank traps. They use improvised explosive devices on dead animals. They go into buildings and they create sort of fortresses, if you will, out of these concrete buildings. And of course, these are the buildings that the United States had designed to be able to withstand earthquakes and typhoons. Yeah. And of course, they're going in there and they're barricading passageways and cutting machine gun slits, literally digging wells in the basement so that they can hold out longer. And
this is hold it there. I mean, amazingly open streets, because it being, we're talking about it's pre-war. Very modernized, very open, very modern, and therefore terrible to fight in, because of a 4-point junction like that with massive great space in American infantry approaching that, you've got those corners covered by snipers, by artillery, by mortars, by firebombing. I mean, just a nightmare to fight through.
And what the Americans ultimately did is, rather than go down the streets, typically the Japanese would have sort of at the end of a long block, they would have a pillbox. And so what the Americans would literally do is they'd go through the buildings and blow out the backs of the buildings and just move through the inside.
Mouse hole through the buildings. Yeah,
we
saw
that footage. Exactly. And of course, not only that, when they got deeper into the city, of course, the Japanese are using the higher floors. They're dropping Molotov cocktails. They're dropping improvised explosive devices. They're using snipers. So it really, it wasn't, I mean, it really came down to clearing buildings and blocks as you sort of moved forward. Because the idea was that the Americans essentially surrounded Manila and then just were compressing in on the city. And of course, throughout, there are all these fortresses. And so they've got to take one after the other. And each of these becomes sort of a battle. Now, as the Americans are doing that, of course, the Japanese start setting fire to Manila. And you can see here the flames and whatnot. They're using, they start above the river that sort of divides the city, and they blow up the financial district. You can see fires there and the smoke. And they sort of work their way, fall back across the river, and they burn the areas. Then they start going through the residential neighborhoods and literally block by block burning them. And you can see here people are fleeing the fires, literally grabbing whatever they can get and trying to get out of this area. And so the Americans are literally pressing block by block deeper into this, having to not only, deal with streams of refugees coming out. And this is a photograph here actually of an intersection. And you can see, it gives you a sense of railroad axles sunk into the road, drums with concrete, all of which there's an earthen pillbox in sort of that top right-hand corner there. So imagine that times 50 all over downtown Manila. And it gives you a sense. Yeah. This is another photograph of a tank trap that they'd set up. Truck bodies wired together, poles. Of course, it's all anchored on the tree by a cable there on the right. So, I mean, the incredible obstacle course for the Americans trying to get deeper and deeper into this.
And I think it's now is a good point, James, to mention, because the civilians, as soon as fire becomes the issue, you can only imagine what it's like if a civilian there. That's when panic reaches its further there, because fire is such a primitive fear for human beings when fire. And in conventional histories about Manila and the Philippines, there has been a suggestion that some of the ensuing violence by the Japanese is kind of driven by that same panic, driven by that same circumstances. But what you outlined in your book is that much more, we'll get into that in a minute, of course, but the premeditated nature of the atrocities. The atrocities aren't coming about accidentally. This is part of the tactics. So you've talked a bit about how they're going to defend these street junctions and use their firepower. But what about the Japanese plan for the people of Manila?
Absolutely. And as the Americans are compressing and the Japanese are burning, all the communication lines in the city are down at this point. I mean, there's no telephones, there's nothing. I mean, so the residents are trapped. They don't know where the Americans are and how to get out. And so a lot of them are stuck having essentially to shelter in place. And, and what happens then is at this point, the Japanese they turn on the civilian population. And they had begun initially by rounding up people they suspected were guerrillas. And it's important to note that there were wonderful Filipino guerrilla outfits in the Philippines that had really harassed the Japanese throughout the war. And it got worse and worse, obviously, leading up to the point actually a bomb was discovered in the basement of Yamashita's headquarters at one point. And so initially the orders are anybody who thinks a guerrilla, feel free to go ahead and kill them if you will. And that by February 9th, literally just 6 days into the battle, all that changes. And that's when Iwabuchi says, essentially everyone is fair game. And they put it in writing. Anybody caught on the battlefield is to be considered a guerrilla, even women and children. And then they give orders on how best to kill people without wasting ammunition. For instance, group them in buildings that are scheduled to be burned, throw them in the river and whatnot. And so what ensues then is a total slaughter of thousands and thousands of civilians, of men, women, and children who were really trapped and can't figure out how to get out. And so it becomes, I think the United States ultimately documented 27 major war crimes, scenes of atrocities coming out of just Manila. And so it really just devolves into hell for the civilians that are trapped.
And setting the scene for that, the American military by this stage of the war have begun to get quite used to atrocities in the Pacific theater. It's not, going back to the days of Bataan, going back to the early part of the war. So I'm not saying they're getting accustomed to it in a sense, but they've certainly had experience of it. But this went off the charts, didn't it? This, in terms of what they've experienced, of everything they've experienced on little levels, was just escalated to a barbaric degree here in Manila, isn't it? And I was reading again, listening to your podcast there. You scanned something like 65,000 pages of original documents for your work, and your months spent at the National Archives. Obviously, a lot of work in the Philippines as well, putting all this stuff together to create this horrible but important archive of atrocity. And we'll get to the actual story in a minute. But when you were putting it together, how difficult was it motivating yourself for another day of reading about Barbary? I mean, did you have to go through counseling? I'm joking, but did you have to have, I remember when Steven Spielberg was making Schindler's List, he would call Robin Williams every night from his hotel to just tell him jokes so he could go back to talking about the Holocaust again the next day. Did you struggle with working on this?
Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, because, it's literally bankers' boxes and bankers' boxes of these accounts in the National Archives. And a lot of these survivor accounts were taken literally within weeks of the Battle of Manila. And so these are fresh statements. A lot of them are dictated from hospital beds, or really, and by hospital, I use that word loosely. Any building that still had a roof was considered an aid center in Manila. And so the barbarity and whatnot, it just bleeds right off of the page. And so, I had to read each of these depositions several times in order to sort of synthesize the material and figure out where it would belong, whether it was going to make it in the narrative. And it was day in and day out. I had dreams about it. I remember my kids would come home in the afternoons from school, and I would just be like, guys, Dad needs a hug, man. I mean, this is just, and they were always like, Dad, you're so weird. And I'm like, no, trust me, Dad just needs a hug. So it definitely, it's overwhelming, the violence that happened there. And it's really, it's comparable to like the Rape of Nanking in China in 1937. It's just,
and again, we said at the top of the show, we don't want to revel in or dwell in these, but we ought to give a couple of examples. So, I mean, straight off my mind is the building and the beheadings, and that one was one of the ones that, if you hadn't kind of put your footnotes in that, I would have kind of somehow imagined that would have been made up. That just sounded so horrific. It couldn't possibly have actually happened. This can only have come out of some horror writer's imagination. But it was true. So share that one with us.
And I'll tell you, Paul, when I was writing the book, I made a point of trying to include as many direct quotes from survivors and from documents as I could without it sort of creating the narrative, without it messing up the narrative, because so much of the horror that happened there is unbelievable. I mean, that story, is a case in point, but that's just one of so many that, like, it's more powerful and to hear it directly from the survivor than to hear it from me as the middleman, as the author. And of course, the story you're talking about for your viewers is the Singalong Death House. And what it was is it's a residential home on Singalong Street in Manila. That street is still there. The home is not there, but the street is. And I've had Filipino friends track down that address. There's now a grocery store on that spot today. But in 1945, it was a home. And what the Japanese did is they went around the neighborhood right around that, and they rounded up hundreds of men, military-age males, 14 on up to grandfather's age. They blindfolded them all, and they went into this house, and they went up to the second floor, and they cut a hole in the floor of the second floor. And then one by one, they would lead these men blindfolded up those stairs. They would then force them to kneel over that hole, where a Japanese soldier would then use a sword and decapitate the person. The head would then fall down the hole, and they'd kick the body from the back, and the body would fall down. And they did this all day long, to the point that it was literally filled up the entire downstairs under there of bodies. The house would eventually burn, and the way we know how many people died there, 200 people. This is actually one of the 9 survivors. And the reason there were 9 survivors is because cutting off somebody's head is actually really difficult with a sword, particularly when you do it 200 times.
Yeah.
So 9 people we know survived that account in order to give statements about it. The building did eventually burn, and the American war crimes investigators went in there and they counted the skulls that were left behind to come up with the figure of those killed. So, but again, nine people have miraculously survived. One of them actually ended up doing a sketch, which is in the book, that sort of shows the layout of it. That's one of the worst of the atrocities, because it was also very labor intensive. What the Japanese tended to do was like what they did at the German Club, which was a big social hall right in downtown Manila. They ran, and all the neighbors had gone there because it had a big lawn area around it, and it was a concrete building. They thought it'd be safe from fire. So with about 500 people crowded there inside and in the crawl space underneath it, they just sealed it up and set it on fire. And of course, that killed most of the people there. Incidentally, the German Club, the property is still there in Manila. It's a gravel lot. Nobody in the 80 years since then has ever built on that property since then. And so, and when I'm in Manila, I frequently will go right past that and sort of and check it out, because it's just haunting, absolutely haunting. But those are kind of some of the examples of some of the horror that went on. And again, we don't belabor that.
We talked before going live, James, about, writing books. I've interviewed however many authors I've interviewed over the last year on World War II TV and the writing process. And I've done a little bit myself, and it's what do you put in and what don't you put in? And am I being too graphic now? Am I putting this in to shock people? Is it right? You were saying that within the Philippines, and you did book tours there. You were really keen at the beginning that this wasn't just a book for home USA to read. It was people to read in the Philippines as well. They were saying you should have even put more stories in it. It didn't quite go tough enough. And yet you had reservations about putting some of the stuff in. So it's that balancing act between appearing to kind of dwell in it and at the same time, because it's repetitive. It's repetitive. Yeah.
Well, and I'll tell you, when I finished the first draft of the book, I gave it to my editor, and he called me up and he said, this is just too bloody. And so we went and we cut probably a couple chapters worth of atrocity scenes out of there, because, 27 major atrocities in Manila. And like a historian, I was trying to be thorough and sort of cover them all in detail. And I had so many records that I was able to cover them all in detail, And so what we did is we cut a couple chapters out and sort of paraphrase what had happened and whatnot. And then when I turned the book in, I read it again the next round. I thought we probably should cut another chapter, maybe even two, for the readability for the American audience. And I'll tell you, it's like my mother won't read the book. It's so violent, so bloody. But my editor came back and he said, no, we're not going to cut anymore. He said, the violence was overwhelming and you need to leave the reader feeling overwhelmed, because that's what it was like. And so, as you noted, when I went to the Philippines, the Battle of Manila is still a very raw subject in the Philippines. Of course, it wrecked generations of families. A friend of mine who grew up partly in the Philippines said, it would come up every Sunday night at family dinner, some way, shape, or form. And so when I went around, I did 11 lectures at different universities, including Santo Tomas, the University of the Philippines. Battle of Manila survivors would all show up. One woman brought me her diary. Another woman brought poems. Another person showed me their shrapnel scars. And of course, they were all like, well, where's my dad's massacre? Or where is, it didn't cover, even as bloody as it was, it didn't quite have enough, if you will. And so I figure we struck the right balance. Then if it's too bloody for some in the U.S. and not bloody enough for families who survived it, then maybe we've kind of struck that right balance. If you can find,
I would agree. And fascinatingly, it hadn't really been covered in that sort of single volume mainstream book before. Something, we couldn't even count the number of books that have covered the Holocaust now over the years. But this, which is not in terms of numbers, but in terms of savagery, in terms of awfulness, is up there as rivaling some of the worst stuff the Third Reich and the SS did, and yet, as you said there, it very, very well talked about in the Philippines, but maybe, I think perhaps with the Pacific Campaign for American readers, there is so much tragedy anyway in it. And we talked about other shows, and the end up, the finale to the Pacific Campaign being Hiroshima and the atomic bombs there, somehow kind of overshadows some of the stuff before then, because that became so monumentally huge. And I think people, as much as they're into the military history, there's only so many tragedies and disasters you can kind of take. And I toy with the idea about having whether a week of tragedies and disasters is too much, whether I shouldn't actually space these shows out over the course of a longer period. But I thought, I think 5 days of talks about this is not too much. I wouldn't do a month of it. I think I would lose viewers if it was just unrelenting horror over a month. But
Well,
it's important. It's important to tackle these subjects.
In like 1945, you have Manila, you have Iwo Jima, you have Okinawa, you have the firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic bomb. I mean, there's so much packed in to those last, 8.5 months of war. And it's so much of it's rough. I mean, just.
Yeah. And the question came up from RC there, is there a Japanese edition of the book, or is there going to be?
I'd love for them to do it, but no, the Japanese, it's funny. They don't really seem to buy much in the way of American World War II stuff for translation. So no, I don't think so. I mean, the book came out in the Philippines. It had a great success there. It'll be coming out in China, I think, later this year. But not Japan, unfortunately.
Sol David said his book in Okinawa, Crucible of Hell, there was a deal struck for it to come out in Japanese, and then at the last moment, it got cancelled along the way there. It does seem to be the case that these books aren't going there yet, which is another subject in Japan's historiography in its own right there. But in terms of the horrors of these stories and obviously it was. When you said you went to the Philippines, people were grateful that you had bought it, and they were almost annoyed when you were not putting their family history in there. But within the USA, what was the feedback to the book there? I mean, it's been out for 3 years now, so I guess you've done the wave of book signings and things there. Mm-hmm. But was there any pushback about the fact it was so horrific?
No, I mean, I think we had one reviewer say it was just, I mean, why would anybody take on a topic this violent? I think. But again, the same review acknowledging it's an important story. So, I mean, and for me, my book prior to this was on the Doolittle raid, the April 1942 strike against Tokyo. That is this very sort of rah American moment. And you kind of go from that to this just total darkness. I think you probably caught some readers who are looking for another Target Tokyo off guard, but in general, I mean, I think it's had a real strong response. I mean, it was picked by Military Times, one of the best military history books of the year. Same with Amazon, same with Kirkus. So, but again, it's a tough story. I mean, it's a tough one to get through.
Yeah, but in a sense, there is a slightly happy ending in that the Philippines now, all these years later, is doing better, and that they. From the people I know from there, they seem to have embraced their wartime history. There's a sense of ownership of it and understanding of it, which is good. And that part of the world, I suppose, in some ways is doing better now. So when you go there now and you see the development and the progression, and of course, independence now, and it must be gratifying that in a sense that evil doesn't win. Goodness will come through in the end. You can't kill a city. You can kill people in a city, but a city can't be destroyed. A population, it wasn't wiped out. There was like a phoenix, it rose again from the ashes, and they've as I say, they've embraced their history and understood it. So that's good. And going the fact you're talking universities is important. I think that history hasn't been forgotten. They are learning from it. And what would the lessons be that you could learn from this? What are the takeaways for humankind from this kind of story?
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting. I mean, one of the big things I think I took away is how literally this 29 days so decimated so much in the Philippines. I mean, really, and it had this huge ripple effect because, it's not just, sort of the military age males that sort of were killed. It was mothers, it was grandparents, it was children. And so you had this huge generational ripple of tragedy that went through so many families that I think really still continues to play out today. And therefore the interest remains really strong. When we were doing our book launch in the Philippines, we were doing it at the Ayala Museum. They were expecting maybe about 100 people to show up. We ended up having over 300 people come. I mean, and I think there's a real sense of that one of the things I think probably out of this book more than any other that I've been so proud of is to sort of see the way folks in Manila have embraced the book and the story and because are studying it because, Manila too, a lot of these buildings that the U.S. kind of considered were really going to end up being teardowns survived because after, the war ended and the Philippines, the U.S. gave the Philippines independence in 1946. And so much of the time since then has really been shaped by the tragedy of this war. And they didn't have the resources to tear down and start over. And so a lot of that history has been preserved. The dungeons at Fort Santiago are still there that you can go through. I mean, there's still shrapnel marks on the front door at the University of Santo Tomas. Even the U.S. Embassy, the flagpole still has shrapnel marks in the patio out back. And so, I mean, if you're interested, Manila is still, it's very much a haunted city. It's haunted by this event and this tragedy, and the markings of it are all still there. That it's, for me, I just find it so fascinating to go back and sort of walk these streets and do it.
And I think also, when I want you to talk about it now, is there was some justice. There were, you said earlier, there were these 27 atrocities identified, and there was a process set up pretty early to record testimonies, interview people. When we look at the ETO and some of the atrocities by the Third Reich, they weren't always investigated because of the new enemy becoming the Soviet Union and deals being done, and there was not always a sense of closure in the ETO with some of those atrocities. So at least here, of course, not everybody who had committed atrocity was brought to justice. Most of the Japanese soldiers were killed, but there was some attempt to kind of draw a line under this and make a public trial. So tell us a little bit about the legal procedures that were set up.
Well, one of the things MacArthur did is on February 17th, literally about halfway through the battle, as reports of these atrocities were coming in, because American troops are stumbling across these massacre sites, he ordered all atrocities investigated. And so what that did is it set in motion just a tremendous amount of research and investigation afterwards. So it's literally, as soon as the battle ended, crime scene investigators were dispatched, and they realized they were looking less at a battlefield and more at a crime scene. And so they set out to gather all this material, which was, the bankers' boxes. And so at least with other atrocities, like what happened in Nanking, we don't have nearly the paper trail that we have out of the Philippines. Now that, of course, set up the trial of General Yamashita, who was put on trial in the fall of 1945 at what was the old High Commissioner's house, is now the U.S. Embassy there, and what was the first war crimes trial in all of Asia. And he was put on trial for failing to control his troops, for allowing this to happen. And so the Battle of Manila, over the course of 32 days, ended up being this just huge trial. 16,000 spectators turned out to watch, 240 witnesses testified about what had happened in Manila. And so literally the battle was ultimately replayed that same year in a courtroom. And a lot of it was actually filmed. And so you can go to the National Archives and you can watch witnesses testifying about it, along with reading the transcript and things like that. And of course, Yamashita was ultimately found guilty. He appealed his case and went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, but he ultimately lost. And then in February 1946, he was literally stripped of his uniform, his insignia, and everything else, taken out to a cane field outside Manila, and he was hanged as a war criminal. And so, that for a lot of the people in the Philippines, that was at least a measure of justice, at least a measure of closure. And
I suppose, when we talk about, the modern parallels of rapes not going reported and things like that, and the bravery it takes to go and report abuse, things like that, I suppose the one saving grace here is that so many people within Manila had a personal story. They'd lost them, that everybody was going out giving their. It's not like you were the only one on the street. Everybody had a story. So I suppose there was a sense of strength in numbers, and you're not the only one revealing these. The actress you talk about and her baby who ended up recreating it for a movie. That's an incredible story. But that you can imagine that individually, if had there not been a procedure immediately, perhaps they'd started to investigate it 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, and people have started rebuilding their lives and moving around, and perhaps you can imagine a much more difficulty getting these people to come forward and tell their harrowing stories. But in that immediacy of it, when it was still raw, and all these, so all your neighbors were all sharing their stories, I suppose that togetherness helped actually with their sense of closure by talking about it. Psychiatrists will, of course, explain that by going through these events, you're helping to take control of it. You're claiming what happened to you as your story. And so there, the fact you have 65,000 documents is proof of the fact that this process was rigorous and extraordinarily detailed, and that must have been part of its success, I suppose.
Yeah, and I'll tell you this: I've heard from so many people in the Philippines who've read the book and whose family members are quoted in it. Because I use those depositions, I use those statements. I've actually provided copies of statements to families of their relatives and what they did. And I'll tell you, I even donated a copy of all of my research files to the Filipinas Heritage Library in Manila, so that anybody who's doing research in the Philippines can go have access to them. And I'll tell you, I had one incident where I had a woman email me, and she said, my brother called me last night and he said, you got to go pick up this book, and our mother is quoted in it. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to end up being one of the the sexual assault victims. And sure enough, it was. And she said, there's a place in the book where one of the interviewers asked a woman who was assaulted if she had shared that information with anybody. And she said no, that she was married and she didn't want to share with anybody. And of course, it was her daughter who was emailing me.
Wow.
And I was waiting for them to be furious that I had put that out there in the book. But the reality was, she said no. She said, we suspected all along that this had happened to our mother, and she was subsequently deceased. She said, but we were so proud to know she had the strength to tell that story to investigators and to make sure that record was preserved. So I was able to then send her her mother's full transcript of what she endured.
And that's important, and an incredibly moving story, James. And and maybe there's people who read your book who are inspired to go and share something that happened to themselves. Maybe it's a way of saying whatever happened to you, people have experienced equally awful, and have gone through it and have survived, and have found the process of explaining it rewarding in some ways, because I say you get that sense of claiming it for yourself. But
absolutely
interesting. I don't really normally go down the counterfactual point of view, but Great Dominion, one of our regular viewers, we talked at the beginning of the show about the possibility of not going through the Philippines. What's your hunch as to what would have happened if they hadn't gone through the city? Would this whole thing have been avoided, or do you think there was kind of a disaster hanging anyway?
Yeah, I think there certainly would have still been a disaster. It might have been a different one. And it goes back to the fact that Manila was in such awful shape leading up, that if America had bypassed and waited till we could go back and after August 15th and gone in September, you'd have had all the internees. It would have all starved to death. Tens of thousands more in the city would have starved to death. I mean, you may have spared the buildings and stuff, but you would have had another humanitarian catastrophe as well. And so, and who's to say what it would have taken at that point to get any of the surviving Japanese out as well. So
and the Japanese have been running out of food as well. And it's impossible to predict what would have happened. But I think I'm with you. I think that everything was set up, unfortunately, for there to be a bad ending there. It was never going to end well. And it ended this particular way, but an alternative would have been equally tragic, just a different way. And
exactly.
we talked about the DP camps in Europe on World War II TV a few weeks ago, and the horrors of that, and feeding people, and that's another aspect as well, is that it's the tragedies that befell these people. The positive that comes out of it is there is a massive American force there immediately with lots of resources, and so those who have survived are getting medical attention very quickly. They are getting food, they're getting doctors, they're getting everything that wouldn't have happened had they not gone through. So it was a swift and violent end that would have probably that happened, that maybe it would have been a slow but equally deadly, but perhaps less violent end, but still awful.
Yeah, that's my view as well.
And MacArthur, we're bringing back to MacArthur because I talk a lot about Eisenhower as being very pragmatic. I'm a very different figure to MacArthur, but Eisenhower doesn't show his emotions too often. One of the times famously in Normandy is when he walks through the Falaise Gap and sees the destruction in the corridor there in Normandy, and refers to it, as you could walk for hundreds of yards without treading on anything except decaying flesh. When did MacArthur enter Manila, and what did he say about it? And what did he say about it, but what couldn't you take from reading between the lines? Because as we know, MacArthur was a master of presenting a version of events that he wanted the public to have. So what did he say publicly, but what did you think he thought privately when he got there?
It's important for viewers to know. I mean, his house was destroyed. I mean, his house was the penthouse atop of the Manila Hotel, which was hit by artillery and burned. And so it literally, there was nothing left for him. In fact, if you go to the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia, the majority of all the artifacts are from 1945 on, because everything that was in there was lost. And so, in fact, so he comes back into the city pretty early on. And of course, he does cable his wife in Australia a couple of times to say, doesn't look like our house is going to survive. And she comes back pretty quickly in March as well. And it's really through her letters that you get a sense more of the family's grief over everything that was lost. Because she writes to a friend, of everything we owned in our beautiful apartment, just like everything else in Manila, it's gone. And, MacArthur stayed in the Philippines up until the end of the war. And then he moves to Japan, where he takes over for the occupation. He stays for a number of years. But I really think that Manila kind of died for him after that. I mean, once his house was destroyed and the city was wrecked and everything, and of course he had a big new important assignment and everything. But after he leaves, he only goes back to the Philippines twice more in his life. And they're both just brief trips. He goes back for the independence ceremony in 1946. And he goes back shortly before his death when he does sort of this worldwide trip. But I think so much of the things he found special kind of died along with the city. And so it broke that tie for him, if you will.
And that's fascinating, because I mean, but it's you're reading into something into his thoughts by what he didn't do as opposed to what he did do. This place, we talked about it. It was the best years of his life there, and I mean, he's still got his wife, he's still got his son, but he's lost his home, he's lost his possessions, and I suppose the fact he didn't talk, if he had tried to talk about it and his own personal loss, it would have sounded a little bit pathetic, and compared to people who'd lost their family members. Him. In fact, it was on the news in England today. I'm going off on a rabbit hole. Brian May of Queen, his house has been flooded. Some houses in London have been flooded today, but he's got like 4 houses. So my sympathy for a guy who's got 4 houses and has lost one of them is less so than it's someone who's lost their own house in London. Yeah. It's just that, in a sense, Brian, shut up, because I'm not feeling much sympathy for you in this case, because you've got millions in the bank. Yeah. So if MacArthur had done a big kind of speech or something, or talked publicly about how awful it was losing his house, people from Manila would go, "Come on, Douglas, we lost our entire family." Yeah, so I suppose a dignified silence was probably the better way to go about it, maybe.
And it was well done, because again, it's through his wife's letters we get more. And again, these were not for public consumption, but for instance, she writes about like all his father's Civil War medals were lost. But what really bothered her is their son's baby book was lost. And so she was writing a letter to a friend about that. Of everything they lost, it was that was the sentimental thing she wanted. And of course, the Japanese, one of the fascinating things they did is when they occupied the city, they went through and they inventoried his house. And you can actually, and I've looked at his inventory, it's in the archives at the MacArthur Museum, and it's like 30 some pages, and they inventoried it down to like how many, pocket squares he had. I mean, what her jewelry was, down to their son's toys were all inventoried. So you actually have a spreadsheet, if you will, of all their belongings that were lost. But yet the thing that bothered her, of course, is that one irreplaceable item, a baby book that's going to have that first clipping of hair and everything, so it is. But again, that was her own private, nothing that was brought publicly.
And again, like I said at the beginning, that it's reading things like that is where I do get a bit more of a modicum of sympathy for the MacArthurs as a couple, and it's almost the opposite way to I think about Montgomery, who I think isn't a particularly nice person, but is a good commander. And I think the other way, I think Douglas MacArthur's maybe not a very good commander, but in some ways there's a human side to him that we have to acknowledge, and he does love his wife, he does love his kid, he dotes on his kid, and they are qualities we can respect and feel empathy towards, even if we don't, say at the beginning, agree with all his decisions. But interesting, how is MacArthur perceived from your experience in the Philippines? Is it the same as it is in the USA today? And has that changed over the years as well?
He's still pretty revered, particularly with the older generation over there. I mean, because of course they remember when he was a very famous figure in Manila and whatnot, and there's a lot of credit given to him for his time there and sort of his efforts there. So the older generations think very, very highly of him. I do think that's changing to some extent with the younger generations. I mean, is just like it does here, is sort of more and more history, and you get further away from the individual, and they sort of recede into history, and you get more of a realistic portrait as opposed to, well, he was one of my dad's good friends, that's starting to change. And of course, there is a battle going on in the Philippines between the Japanese and over sort of controlling the narrative over who's responsible for more destruction, et cetera, that you're seeing play out in the Philippines as well. And of course, the Japanese spend a lot of money in Manila in the Philippines. They're one of the largest providers of foreign aid and things like that. And so they are being successful in sort of shaping the narrative of World War II there.
Which is, how historiography works, and that's progression, it's development, and the Philippines have every right to push themselves forward in the way they want to do and write their own history, or tell their history the way they want to, and that's all important. And it's interesting, MacArthur is definitely in his trough at the moment, because we look at certain figures since the war, they have been revered and he's definitely at the bottom of a trough at the moment, and I don't immediately see him getting out of that trough. I mean, Churchill's been up and down a bit, Montgomery, Eisenhower has not really had a trough, but I think it's only a matter of time before someone finds some kind of skeleton in the cupboard and brings something about Eisenhower. But MacArthur, again, it goes back to understand how revered he was once, and he's well and truly come off that pedestal now as terms of how military historians think. And yet veterans, and the few veterans there are now, again, in that kind of pattern way, he had that way to kind of have magic over men who he served under, who don't see him perhaps in the same objective way as historians do. And MacArthur's a bit Marmite, we're saying, and some people love him, some people don't, but I think a lot of his men did seem to buy into the press version of his story. Perhaps it's interesting.
Yeah. Some did. The ones on Bataan and Corregidor,
less so. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? But anyway, I think we'll bring things to an end now. But I mean, in terms of getting across everything about the Manila in 1945, anything else that we haven't said that you want to make a point to our viewers about that city, or something they should know?
No, I think you've covered it very thoroughly, Paul. I think it's been a great interview.
Well, I hasten to say I enjoyed the show. It seems somehow inappropriate for so much, and and I have. Folks, I said we haven't put the whole litany of awful stories. You do have to go and read it. And as usual, folks, the link is in the description below, and the link to James's website as well there. And you've done there's other things on YouTube and other podcasts you've done. So there's more information out there. But I will just say goodbye to the viewers what we've got coming up next, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So, folks, Disasters and Tragedies Week continues tomorrow. It's Lidic in Czechoslovakia tomorrow. Then we've got a tragedy in Norway the following day, which is like a mini version of Lidic, and then the week continues. So it's going to get worse before it gets better, in a sense of, but not on the scale. Thursday's story is the smallest tragedy, but no less tragic because of it. But anyway, stick with it. Check us out on Patreon, share what we're doing with your friends, like everything, comment after the shows over, that helps me enormously, and just keep on coming back and watching more history, because we enjoy what we do here, even in a subject like today when it's a little bit nasty. But right now it remains for me to say thank you very much, James, for joining us. And I'll hold up the book there. I'm costing people a fortune in all the books I'm recommending over the weeks, but there are libraries as well if you can't afford it, folks. But it's one of those books that you, at the end of it, you're glad you've read it, but you kind of don't want to dive back in immediately. You kind of take a break from it, put it on the shelf, and go, "Phew, it's not hard going," because it's a page turner, but it is the brutality gets overwhelming at times. I had to take a bit of a break from reading it and read something a bit more light-hearted for a bit, and then back in it again when I read it. But anyway, amazing stuff. So thanks very much, James. What are you working on now, by the way? I haven't asked you that. What's your next World War II foray?
Happy story on the firebombing of Tokyo, March.
Oh God. Okay.
So I'm actually hoping to get that wrapped up here pretty soon. Again, it's a nitty gritty, put you on the ground in the middle of it all. And of course, that takes place literally just a week after.
Yeah, we talked about that with Ian Tarlow. I guess you must be helping you out with stuff, because Ian's written about that. And that's another horrible, traumatic, horrible event. But I'm interested in your take on that, because that, I guess, again, it's civilian side particularly, and the accounts of survivors. And that's a... Well, when you finish that one, will you come back on and talk about that, please?
Love to. Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, okay then, folks. This is it. This is Paul Woodhead for World War II TV. I will see you all again tomorrow when we go off to Czechoslovakia for another massacre in Tragedies and Disasters week. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll see you all again.
Thank you.